Welcome everyone to this special episode of our PFAS video series where we cover today important developments related to the molecule TFA. First of all, what is TFA? TFA stands for trifluoroacetic acid. It is a small molecule consisting of one fully fluorinated carbon atom attached to a carboxyl group. Although such short-chain fluorinated carbon molecules do not fall under the PFAS definition used by the US EPA, they are considered PFAS under the EU definition. TFA has several industrial uses. However, it is also known as a metabolite, as a degradation product of various pesticides. Fluorine is often used in pesticide chemistry to increase stability and performance. As a result, fluorinated active substances may have the potential to degrade into TFA. This is why the latest news on the classification of TFA is of particular importance for the pesticide industry. So, what happened? At the European Chemicals Agency, ECHA, a harmonized classification procedure for TFA has been pending for some time. Under this procedure, it was proposed to classify TFA as toxic to reproduction. The minutes of the Risk Assessment Committee, the RAC, have now become available. According to these minutes, the RAC concluded, among other things, that TFA should be classified as toxic to reproduction, category 1B or reprotoxic 1B. Here's my quick assessment of what this means in practice. First, this is not yet the final classification. The RAC opinion still needs to be submitted to the European Commission, followed by the relevant coordination and formal harmonization steps. However, given this scientific assessment, it appears highly unlikely that the substance of the conclusion will change. Therefore, stakeholders should assume that TFA will ultimately receive a harmonized R1B classification. Second, if pesticides degrade to TFA as a metabolite, the reproductive toxicity classification becomes highly relevant for the so-called groundwater assessment during the pesticide approval or renewal process. Depending on the specific active substance, use pattern, exposure scenario and expected groundwater concentrations, it is possible that certain pesticides may no longer meet the applicable approval criteria in light of this classification. Third, the classification does not automatically mean that real-world use of pesticides or exposure to TFA pose a risk to human health. As already recognized in ancient Greek thinking and later famously expressed by Paracelsus, the dose makes the poison. In other words, a hazard classification identifies an intrinsic toxicological property, but the concrete risk depends on exposure, dose and the specific circumstances of use. Based on what I have heard from toxicologists so far, there does not appear to be an assumption that current real-world exposure levels for pesticide necessarily create a human health risk. Fourth, how will regulators react? So far, pesticide regulators have largely followed the established procedure. TFA has been considered as a metabolite in the routine renewal process of pesticide active substances. At this stage, I'm not aware of any indication that non-routine assessments, such as the so-called Article 21 reviews, have been triggered specifically because of this development. However, it remains to be seen whether the new classification will lead to a change in strategy by the risk manager, in particular the European Commission. Let me also highlight two other important pending procedures which are relevant here. First, there is an ongoing ECHA mandate requested by the European Commission to assess the toxicological reference values for TFA. The deadline for this assessment is expected at the end of July. This scientific assessment by the European Food Safety Authority EFSA will provide important data for understanding what the classification means in terms of human health assessment. Second, there's another pending mandate involving both EFSA and ECHA to assess the fate and behavior of TFA in soil and water. The deadline for this assessment is June 2027. This assessment will also provide important information for the regulatory evaluation of TFA. So, overall, the high likelihood of a reproductive toxicity classification for TFA is not unexpected. Many stakeholders had already anticipated this outcome. It also is not surprising that pesticide critical stakeholders may now use this momentum to frame the issue in a particularly alarming way. At the same time, while the pesticide regulatory system relies strongly on hazard-based elements, we should always keep in mind that the risk describes the potential impact on human health or the environment under actual exposure conditions and not the hazard alone. The key question now is how regulators and risk managers will respond to this development in practice. This includes whether they will continue to address TFA within the routine renewal procedure for pesticides active substances, or whether they will consider additional or non-routine regulatory steps. For the time being, the situation remains dynamic. Stakeholders should closely follow the next steps at EU level, in particular the finalization of the harmonized classification, the pending EFSA assessments, and any potential follow-up actions by the European Commission and Member States. I'm happy to exchange and discuss anytime with you about developments in your business. Thank you very much for your attention and see you again the next time.